Golden State Media Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast is your one-stop shop for fantasy football news and advice. Can't decide on who to draft on the first round? Going gaga on how to line up your team. Got you covered. Traditional league, dynasty league, PPR league, IDP league, even daily fantasy football league. Join us as we break down all the questions of fantasy football. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast.
Thank you for tuning in to the Golden State Media Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast, where we discuss all things fantasy football. As always, I'm Jeremiah.
And I'm Anthony.
And we got another action-packed show for you guys today, Week 17. For most of you fantasy players out there, the season's practically over, but and you're probably now listening to this show. But for those that are still playing, we're always got your back. We got your back. We're going to try to put the team on your back like Marshawn Lynch did in Seattle in 2009. But all the hardcore NFL fans will get that reference. But we got a lot to talk about. We're going to discuss some Week 17 matchups with some players involved. We're going to discuss some notable injuries from Week 16. I barely touched on a couple of these injuries in the show earlier this week, but we can go a little bit more in depth, and we're gonna try to do probably a 2016 year review, Anthony.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we're gonna probably say like the biggest bust of the year, the biggest overall fantasy player, or the top fantasy or the breakout star, so to speak. What I'm trying to say, because I talked about my fantasy MVP in the last show. I said it was David Johnson. Maybe Anthony can get his take on that. But yeah, let's get started on this show, shall we? So we got some Week 17 matchups, and I think the biggest one this week is none other than the Sunday night matchup between the Green Bay Packers at the Detroit Lions. This is for the NFC North.
Yeah, so with this matchup, division. This is one of the few games that actually matters the most, because if you look at some of the other games, be it Seattle and 49ers, that's going to have a matchup that people don't necessarily care about.
That game still kind of matters, though, for the Seahawks.
For the Seahawks, but not for the Niners. You got Baltimore and Cincinnati, which is basically just like, okay, cool, we're going to play this game. Same thing with Houston and Tennessee. Everything there is either wrapped up or they're just, basically with Tennessee playing a backup. So with the Detroit Lions and the Green Bay Packers, you have two teams that are fighting for a division lead. And even if the other team loses, they still have a chance of making the playoffs, assuming that Washington loses as well. I mean, you even have a scenario where if they both tie, they basically both make it into the playoffs. But more specifically, looking at this game, looking at Detroit and Green Bay, you have a matchup of one of the best quarterbacks right now, one of the best quarterbacks of all time, and Aaron Rodgers. Basically, he might win MVP because, honestly, MVP is kind of like a mangled race this year with, Ezekiel Elliott, Dak Prescott, Tom Brady, Matt Ryan. It's kind of a jumbled up thing. And Aaron Rodgers right now leads the league right now in touchdowns with 36. And over the last 5 weeks, he's been basically what you would have hoped Aaron Rodgers would have been, right? So he's had 11 touchdowns and 0 interceptions in those 5 games. And then even the game before that, he threw 3 touchdowns and 0 interceptions. So in his last 6 weeks, 14 touchdowns and 0 interceptions, beating the Vikings division rival, beating the Bears division rival, beating the Seahawks, beating the Texans, and beating the Eagles. Basically, he's been everything you'd hoped he would be, and even somebody like a Jordy Nelson, who kind of started off the year kind of not what you would hoped he would be, which makes sense because, after that kind of injury, you're going to come back hobbled, you're going to come back not exactly at full strength. Even if your knee is full strength, your mind isn't necessarily at full strength because you don't want to cut, you don't want to do these things just because in your head you're like, oh, I might hurt it again. So it takes a little bit of time for you to get back there. But, if you look at his production that he's been having as of late, and I say as of late, I mean basically since basically the 13th of November against Tennessee, he's had 100-yard games 4 times, and even in the other game, he had 91 yards receiving. And even those 2 weeks before Tennessee against the Colts and the Falcons, he had 94 and 94. So basically, over the last 10 weeks, I believe it is, 9 or 10 weeks, he's had 4 games where it's been 100 yards receiving and 3 of them with 91 or more. He's been one of the best wide receivers in the game throughout the season since that point. And he's had basically 1,200 yards receiving, 91 catches, and 14 touchdowns. And, kind of going into a more fantasy football specific kind of a realm, he's somebody who you would absolutely need to look at as far as somebody that, if you're still going this week, be it your, if your fantasy league is still going, or if you're doing something like a DraftKings or FanDuel, something like that, you need to start somebody who, can get you some points, because this kind of week is always weird because you have people who are starting or sitting, kind of like, we got everything wrapped up, so you don't expect Tom Brady, who's been a, nice fantasy option for you the whole year. You don't expect him to be good. You don't, at least not to play, because they have nothing really to play for outside of the number 1 seed, and if they're up 14-0 after the first quarter, they'll take him out. So you don't expect him to do well. You don't expect somebody like I'm trying to think who else would be, like Ezekiel Elliott or Dak Prescott, somebody like that. You don't expect them to basically have the kind of protection that they've had in the last few weeks, because if they're up by any stretch, at the second or third quarter, they're going to be taken out. So with Jordy Nelson, this is why we kind of started with this game, right? They have something where they have to play for something, which is a division and a top 4 seed. So if they get that, then all of a sudden you look at Jordy Nelson and you say, okay, he's had 100 yards, last 2 weeks, 154 and 2 touchdowns and 124 yards receiving. He's been one of the best receivers over the last month of the season, and he is somebody that, like, especially in this game, I think you have to just, if you can get him, I don't care if it's FanDuel, you got to pay a bunch of money, he's someone you definitely go for.
Like I said, I don't care if you have to pay a bunch of money. Yeah, go get him. But you talked about mostly players on the Green Bay side.
Right.
No, on the Green Bay side. There's a couple of players I want to talk about on Detroit, but one player in particular that I want to touch on that you didn't get to touch on for the Packers is Ty Montgomery.
Right.
In some leagues, he does have dual eligibility as a receiver and a running back, which is kind of like a cheat code, so to speak.
Yep, a little bit.
And he's kind of been heavily involved in the running game lately in the past 2 weeks, which was something that was missing in the Packers offense, was the running game. And I feel like Ty Montgomery is the guy for Green Bay right now, because when we saw it week 15 against Chicago, he went wild for 162 yards and 2 touchdowns on the ground. Minnesota was a little bit more disappointing, but to be fair, he was playing against a very solid defense. He finished that game with 23 yards on 9 carries. But I do expect a really good week from Ty Montgomery on the ground. I think they're going to try to involve Ty Montgomery. I think he's going to be a huge factor in the playoffs for the Packers, because I think the Packers are going to win this game going to the playoffs. So
right.
I do think he's going to have a very good game. But as for Detroit, 2 players in particular are Golden Tate and Marvin Jones, 2 players that have gone opposite directions.
Yeah.
Marvin Jones looked like he was pretty much the number 1 receiver in this offense. After going for over 200 yards against this same Green Bay Packers team, but this was in September, he went over 200 yards and 2 touchdowns in that game.
Right.
And ever since, the highest he has reached, receiving total that is, was 74 yards the next week against the Chicago Bears. And he hasn't done a whole lot in this offense ever since. He did have 94 yards against Washington in October, but other than that, he's just been a non-factor. So the other receiver on this team, Golden Tate, he kind of has gone back a little bit. He has exactly 1,000 yards right now. So if I were to bet on one of these receivers, I'll probably go with Golden Tate, honestly, because there's just been opposite directions. But in other games this weekend, though, Anthony, there's a couple other games that kind of do matter in the playoffs. And, most notably, they're in the AFC West with the Denver Broncos taking on the Oakland Raiders and the Chiefs taking on the Chargers. And as for the Kansas City Chiefs, I think the 2 biggest fantasy players are on the Chiefs, and that is Travis Kelce and Tyreek Hill.
Right.
Travis Kelce has been, I think, he has emerged as a top 2 tight end in the league. He has over 1,000 yards receiving. He has 4 touchdowns. Melvin Gordon for the San Diego Chargers has probably been the only bright spot of the Chargers outside of Phil Rivers, but Phil Rivers is a turnover machine. Melvin Gordon does have 10 touchdowns. He's only 3 yards away from a 1,000-yard season. And, Phil Rivers does have over 4,000 yards passing. He has 31 touchdowns, but he does have his turnover ratio is not very good. As for the Oakland Raiders, Derek Carr is hurt, unfortunately, due to a fractured fibula. He finishes the year with 3,937 passing yards and 28 touchdowns. Latavius Murray has been a very integral part in this Oakland offense with 12 touchdowns and 777 yards. But the Oakland Raiders have a 3-headed monster in the backfield with Jalen Richard, who has emerged as a very good complementary back. DeAndre Washington, who had a real great game last week against the Chargers. I think he finished over 100 yards and 2 touchdowns. The Broncos, on the other hand, they haven't been able to run the ball. And I've been saying for a couple of weeks, for fantasy purposes, I would just stay away from the Broncos running backs right now. There's just no clear-cut running back. No one has really emerged as the number one guy. They don't know how to run the ball well. And even on the receivers for the Broncos, they don't have any help with Trevor Siemian there.
Right.
With Paxton Lynch starting, I don't see them going any way about it. As for the Raiders receivers, Matt McGloin is playing. I actually like Matt McGloin in this matchup, even though he is playing the Broncos defense.
I would be afraid of him against.
I wouldn't start him. I like him like reality football. But Amari Cooper and Michael Crabtree, I would stay away from those guys because of I don't think their numbers are going to be as high as you like to be. But I would honestly. I actually like Latavius Murray, Jalen Richard, and DeAndre Washington in this game. I like all 3 of them. The one that I would start the most was probably Latavius Murray, and I would probably start DeAndre Washington or Jalen Richard in the flex. As for that game, as for the Chiefs, you got to start Tyreek Hill. I think it's he's kind of emerged as a must start.
Yeah, no, he's been, whether it's been rushing, receiving, kickoff, punt return, he's been somebody who's just been one of those guys that, as of the last 5 weeks or so, he's been somebody that you definitely have to go to. You look at a couple of other things really quick as far as people from those games that you might want to, look at and see what you're going to do. Like you talked about, since Derek Carr has broken leg, Matt McGloin, he's going to have to go against that really good Broncos defense. But you also look at somebody like a Crabtree. I think he can do some really good things, just kind of like a dink and dunk kind of scenario with it because he's not going to throw deep to Cooper as much. I think he's just going to want to kind of check down, do stuff like that. Crabtree can help a lot with that, get you some receptions, especially if you're doing a PPR league and if you're doing something where the receptions of DraftKings, FanDuel can actually help you out. I think he is going to be somebody who can definitely do a lot with that. But we'll take our first break right now. We're going to come back. We're going to talk about kind of under the radar people that you should start. Like we talked about these 3 games. We'll talk about some people in other matchups that, when we say it's probably wait, what, start him? Why? But we'll explain that in the next segment. But we're going to take our first break here at the Golden State Media Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
And welcome back to the Golden State Media Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast. All right, so last segment we talked about a couple of games and people that you should start, a lot of Ty Montgomery, Aaron Rodgers, people like that. So now we're going to go to the rest of the games this weekend, and even though the ones we talked about are the ones that matter, quote unquote, because they help you get into the playoffs and seeding and everything else like that, there are other games that are going to be played, and while those games aren't necessarily something that have as much leeway as far as like people aren't going to play as much, you're going to have some of the starters, especially with like the Cowboys, they're going to bench some of their people. So we'll look at these other games and kind of like sneaky people who like you wouldn't expect that you should start, but if you looked at it, it would make more sense than you think. So someone who's actually had a good year who I think you should look at first off is Terrell Pryor for the Browns. And I understand it's the Browns and the Browns stink and the Browns won one game last week and now all of a sudden everybody loves them because, oh, my God, they're not the worst team that we've ever seen in our lives. But one thing to remember about someone like a Terrell Pryor, right? Like, he might not come back to the Browns next year. This could be his kind of last opportunity to kind of show what he can do before he gets out of there, because you saw the whole thing that was happening to him earlier with, who is it, the cornerback, Pac-Man Jones.
Not only that, Brian Hartline, his
Hartline called him out.
And Ohio State called him out as well.
Right. So you had these kind of things with him, and you had the situation where now he kind of has something to prove going into the final week of the season, and also he has 913 yards. He's probably going to want to get that 1,000-yard season, and at this point, why wouldn't the Browns give that to him? Like, it's not like they're playing for anything. They may not want to win the game because if they win, then all of a sudden they may not have the number one overall pick, but just I can see him getting around 100 yards because, he's been, for all the garbage talk, that was happening with Pac-Man Jones and everything else, he has had 3 games this year with over 100 yards and a 97-yard game, and he's been really, really, really good as far as the wide receiver goes, kind of out of the blue, and I can see him in this last game possibly with the Browns, stepping up and getting around 100 yards and getting over that 1,000-yard threshold that if you're a free agent, that's going to be something that, you want to showcase. You want to show people that you're worth the money that he's going to throw out there, even though you got the kind of garbage moniker with stuff like that. You had 100 yards against the Dolphins. You had 100 yards against the Giants, 2 defenses that are pretty good this season. You had it against the Jets and Darrelle Revis and, all the stuff that we talked about this year with him possibly not being the same dude. You still want to go out strong, and I can see Terrell Pryor, in his last game against the Steelers, because the other thing you got to realize with the Steelers, they're not going to play for anything. They've got the 3 seed wrapped up. They're not losing the division. I don't think they can drop down to the 4 seed. I'm pretty sure that stays with the Texans, and I think the number 2 seeds is either Texans or either the Chiefs or the Raiders. So they're basically locked into the 3 seed no matter what happens. You don't want Ben Roethlisberger to get hurt. You don't want Le'Veon Bell to get hurt. You don't want Antonio Brown to get hurt, so you're going to rest some players. That leaves the possibility for Terrell Pryor to get some yards, and I can see him exploding this week and having a really good game.
Yeah, and don't forget to point out the Pittsburgh Steelers are going to sit some players in this game, including Le'Veon Bell, Ben Roethlisberger, and Antonio Brown, the ultimate killer bees. They're going to sit those guys. So I do like the Cleveland Browns' chances for a win, to get their second win of the season, go on a 2-game winning streak to end 2016, and hopefully write it off to 2017, but it's probably not going to happen. And you know what that means? That means the Niners will lose to the Seahawks, and the Niners will clinch the number 1 pick in the draft. But I don't know. I'm dreaming. 2 players that I want to actually going to talk about 2 players real quick. But one is actually playing in his final game in the NFL career.
Right.
That's Steve Smith. He is playing against the Cincinnati Bengals this Sunday. And, the Cincinnati, they've been okay on defense, but they haven't been as good as they've been in the past few years, so to speak. So both of these teams are not playing for nothing. The Ravens lost their chance of getting clinching a division title last week against the Steelers. The Bengals have been out of playoff contention for a few weeks now, so both of these teams are not really playing for anything. But I do think Steve Smith is going to try to go out on top. I think he's going to get a lot of targets in this game. I think he's going to have a huge game. I don't want to predict the yardage because, I don't want to overhype you guys. I do see him gaining at least 1 touchdown in this game. But I do see him at least going over 100 yards in this game. I expect a very good game from Steve Smith this Sunday against the Cincinnati Bengals. And I want to talk about a player in the Buffalo Bills and New York Jets game. This is the first game after Rex Ryan has been fired as the Bills head coach. The New York Jets, they just absolutely terrible. Probably one of the worst defenses. They're not the worst, but they're definitely in the bottom 5. Buffalo wants to end the year on a really good note here. I think Sammy Watkins is going to be someone that's going to have a huge game. Remember, Tyrell Taylor is not going to start in this game. He's going to get benched, and E.J. Manuel is going to start in this game for the Buffalo Bills at quarterback. We already seen what E.J. Manuel has done as a quarterback. He's been a first-round bust, so to speak, ever since he came out of Florida State. But Sammy Watkins, he had a huge game against the Miami Dolphins last week. He finished the day with 154 yards and a touchdown on 10 targets. And I do think he's going to get somewhat close to that. He might get even better numbers. Remember, this is against the Miami Dolphins defense that's been pretty solid. They're not great. They're probably more the middle of the pack type of defense this year, but they are a playoff team. And the New York Jets are far from a playoff team. They're fighting for probably a top 5 spot in the draft. They're very bad on defense. Remember, Andrew Luck absolutely torched this defense for 1 quarter and a half. Colin Kaepernick torched this defense. So I do expect. I'm not going to say E.J. Manuel is going to torch this defense. I'm not going to say that, but I do expect Sammy Watkins to be somewhat involved in this game. And I do expect him to finish with a huge game against the New York Jets this Sunday.
No, I like that one. All right, so the final one I'll do for the kind of sleeper, someone that you don't necessarily think will kind of do that great of things. So the one game that I'm looking at when it comes with this, again, we kind of talk about, we can do an obvious one. You can say something like Drew Brees because he needs 150 yards or so to get to 5,000 yards, and I think it's the 5th time he's going to do something like that. You can talk about the Giants and Redskins game, but that actually has some kind of meaning going into it. You could even talk about the Cardinals. You could talk about David Johnson and how he can basically continue that, 100 yards of total offense for every single game. But the last one that I'm going to do, the last kind of person that I'm going to look at, kind of out of the blue, but just kind of considering what everyone has to play for and kind of the mentality of the team they're playing, I'm going to say Tom Savage has a good game. I'm going to say Tom Savage because this is the last game before they make it into the playoffs, right? Everybody basically considers the Texans a joke, right? Everybody considers them as basically the team that's going to get waxed by either the Chiefs or even possibly the Raiders with a backup quarterback of their own.
Or maybe the Steelers. I don't know.
And you look at something with the Texans, their defense is very good, but the quarterback situation, when they took Osweiler out, they were cheering. It didn't matter who it was. Tom Savage was just the guy they got to cheer for. Back of his the name on the back of his jersey could have just said not Brock Osweiler, and they would have cheered for it. It didn't really matter what in the world happened. But with Savage, I think he can actually do some good things because if you look at how he's been doing so far, he had 260 yards against the Jacksonville Jaguars, and that, they're a bad team, obviously, but, in his basically first game in there, actually starting everything else like that, he did pretty well. And I think he can do something with this offense, right? He's the one that basically found DeAndre Hopkins' body because he wasn't used as all because Fedorowicz and all Osweiler did was throw to stupid Fedorowicz and stupid tight ends and the running back. Anyways, that's just my anger because I had Hopkins for fantasy. But I do think that Tom Savage can basically reignite this offense and basically get it to a better place. And you look at the Tennessee Titans, and while they have been a team that was really good this year and close to making the playoffs, now they have nothing to play for, and they just saw their quarterback go down. Do you really think they want to basically have anybody else on the team go down? Probably not. And the Texans at least have something to play for just to make sure their quarterback's actually someone that you can rely on, because if Savage goes out and looks terrible, they're going to go back to Osweiler. They want some kind of stability, so I can see them kind of relying and kind of making sure Savage gets some reps, gets some looks and everything like that to make him look like someone who you can have faith in going in next week when they finally play a playoff game.
Yeah, and I don't know if I like the Tom Savage.
That's why you don't have to like it. That's why it's a sleeper. That's why not everybody.
I don't know. This is probably one of those unwatchable games of the weekend.
Oh, it's going to be a bad game, but at least it's something that you can use, fantasy-wise. Yeah.
Well, I do like that, but we're going to take our last break, and this is our last break of 2016.
Yes, it is.
This is the last show that we're going to do 2016, but we're going to kind of do a year in review, so to speak, segment in this show. So we'll be right back here at the Golden State Media Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast.
Are you looking for the very best NFL and college football podcast? Then check out the GSMC Football Podcast. Get the latest football news both on and off the field. From the NFL Draft to trades to the rumor mill to the NFL Combines, they got you covered. That's GSMCpodcast.com/football-podcast. Get updates on college rivalries, game day insights, and much, much more. It's football talk the way you want it. This show eats, sleeps, and breathes football. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit GSMCpodcast.com for more info.
And welcome back to the Golden State Media Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast. And Anthony, we're literally, it's like around 10 o'clock, December 30th. We're like less than 48 hours away from New Year.
Yep.
Yeah. Literally, we're.
Did you not know how the math went in your head? You were
I
just,
didn't know.
you just knew 2 days was 48 hours. You're like, we're less than 48 hours? Yes, we're less than.
Yeah, I don't know why I had to think about it. Okay?
We're less than 38
I
hours
was a
away.
comms major in college, okay? I did it because I hated math.
That's fine. Everyone hates
Okay.
math to a degree.
It's okay. But, yes, we're less than 48 hours away from the 2017 year.
Mm-hmm.
We're in for a new year, and of course, 2017 means playoff football, like in real life, not fantasy. Fantasy playoffs already happened, and then we had another year ahead of us of fantasy football, which will be here throughout the entire year, and there's no off season here at the GSMC Podcast Network. But we're gonna talk about our biggest bust of the year. Our biggest breakout players of the year, and I already talked about my fantasy MVP in the show earlier this week, so Anthony's going to have his take on that. I said David Johnson was the MVP, and I'm going to say more why. But yeah, let's begin, Anthony. So you want to start off with the biggest bust of the year?
All right, so the biggest bust of the year, you could look a couple other places. You've got yours. You could maybe talk about something like an Adrian Peterson, but that's not necessarily his fault, right? Like it's something that, he got hurt. And even though that does make you a bust, you tend to look more of the bust of the players who have been playing, right? Someone who has been playing all year and hasn't lived up to expectations. And for mine, this is a little bit selfish. That's fine. It's someone that I understand he's had a bad year. And why do I know he's had a bad year? Because I have him on my fantasy team, and every single time they play, I want him to just do anything. Just try anything. Just DeAndre Hopkins. And it's not even his fault. That's the thing. It's not even DeAndre Hopkins' fault. I do not blame him. He's one of the best wide receivers in the league. Brock Osweiler, you got him from the Broncos. You thought he was going to be good, and you basically made DeAndre Hopkins irrelevant. The man has 831 yards so far this year. And unless he has some 170-yard breakout game, he's going to go under 1,000 yards after literally the year before going over 1,500 yards and over 1,200 yards the year before that. Like I said, he's been very underwhelming. I don't fully blame him for it, but he's someone who's, like I said, he played in 15 games. He's played in all the games. And before last week, when Tom Savage basically got him 87 yards against the Jaguars, the highest so he had 113 yards he did against the Chiefs in week 2 for Hopkins. Like, okay, great, yay, fantastic. After that, 71 yards. That's the most he had. And that game went into overtime. He had to do extra time just to get those yards. DeAndre Hopkins, for me, is probably the, most underwhelming fantasy football player this year. And I'm only giving that to him because you didn't have any expectations for Brock Osweiler, and I can't put that on him.
Yes, and I do agree that DeAndre Hopkins is one of the most disappointing players this year. But I do think the biggest bust of the 2016 fantasy season, I'm going to have to go with Todd Gurley of the St. Louis Rams.
That's not bad. That's pretty good.
He's been healthy in this entire year.
Mm-hmm.
And even against a bad 49ers team who he played twice already, he didn't do so well.
No.
Okay, first game of the year against the 49ers on Monday nights. It's the first week of the year, so you don't know how good or bad these teams are. The Niners won that game 20-0, even though it's probably a really ugly game. Probably one of the worst games of the year.
Mm-hmm.
Definitely in the top 5.
Yep.
So the Niners are definitely in the top 5 of the worst games of the year. They have multiple games in that countdown. But I'm not going to go any further detail in that. But, in that first game, he only mustered up 47 yards of 17 carries, averaging 2.8 yards a carry no touchdowns. His longest rush of that game was 10 yards.
Yeah.
Okay, so his first year, I'm like, okay, he has to shake off the rust. He's gonna play. He's gonna play. He's gonna be healthy. Okay, I'm not worried about nothing right now. Okay, against Seattle Seahawks, this is a very tough opponent. Very bad matchup for most running backs out there. He only mustered 51 yards on 19 attempts, 2.7. Okay, cool. Then in week 3 rolls by. Okay, 85 yards on 27 carries. Even though it is 3.1 yards, he had 2 touchdowns. Okay, cool. Okay, he's getting on track. Then fast forward to week 4 to Arizona, 19 carries, 33 yards, 1.7. Okay, so after this game, the highest he's ever had was 76 yards after the game he had 85. So he hasn't had a 100-yard rushing yard game this entire year, and he's only averaged 3.2 yards a carry. Only has 6 touchdowns after having an incredible year last year. We're looking at Todd Gurley I think he won Rookie of the Year.
He was one of the players that you kind of looked this year and you wanted to see if he can basically take that next step, because you get 1,000 yards in your rookie season, you get 10 touchdowns, you look like somebody who can be a top 5 fantasy back going forward and basically be someone that you can rely on. You said you didn't even have 100 yards rushing the whole year. Only one time this whole season did he have over 100 yards of total offense, and that only happened, like you said, with the game. Well, it wasn't the Dolphin game. It was actually the game where he had 106 or 108 yards, against the Buffalo Bills in week 5. That's it. That's because he had 72 and 36, 72 rushing, 36 receiving. He's been somebody who just has been, the whole Rams as a season's been underwhelming, but he's probably been the forefront of just like how the Rams have been underachieving this whole year.
Yeah, and he's probably in one of the worst offenses in the league.
Right.
Jared Goff has, even though he is still rookie, he hasn't looked as good as the other rookie quarterbacks have.
No.
Todd Gurley. The offensive line hasn't been good.
Yeah, too.
They don't have any receivers there. And Todd Gurley had an incredible rookie year. He finished 2015 with 1,106 yards and 10 touchdowns. He averaged 4.8. Fast forward to this year, he has 845, 3.2, and 6 touchdowns. So it was a very underwhelming year for the second-year running back in L.A. But yeah, I think ever since his move to L.A., the Rams have they've just been terrible, and I don't think L.A. wants that team now. I don't think
they care that much,
and they're probably going to get the Chargers, who are just as dysfunctional as the Rams are.
So going from bad, we'll go to more positive now. So we'll go with the biggest breakout star. So for me, okay, fine, this is a little selfish, me being a Dolphins fan, but Jay Ajayi has 3 games this year with 200 yards rushing, and he didn't have anything close to that before that. He's been somebody who's basically come out of nowhere. Like, I understood Jay Ajayi was there, but you also had the Dolphins start off the year with, now I'm totally blanking on his name.
Arian Foster.
Arian Foster, yeah, you had him, Arian Foster, and he was somebody who you thought, could get you some veteran presence, get you, close to 1,000 yards. But Ajayi, basically the first game of the season, he didn't even play. So he's getting these 1,200 yards in 14, as of right now, games. And he started off the year 14 yards, 28 yards, 33 yards, 42 yards. So he barely had over 100 yards through the first 5, like I said, because the first one he didn't play, weeks of the season. And then bam, 200, bam, 200, bam, 100, 77, 79, 77. And then this last week against the Bills, 200 yards again. Like, he's been somebody who now is the Dolphins running back, period, end of story. He's the guy going into the next season because he could get 1,300 yards easily coming out of this season and maybe 10 touchdowns, which is a nice kind of round number. And he's been somebody that, second-year player out of Boise State, you didn't expect that much out of him because last year he only had 187 yards rushing, and he had 3 games this year of over 200 yards. He's clearly the breakout star, at least for me.
Yeah, and that's a real good one. He literally came out of nowhere, and he had 2 100-plus yard rushing games twice against a Rex Ryan defense.
Yeah, so there's that part too.
So there's that, and he's really come out of nowhere. But
so
my breakout player of the year is none other than Terrell Pryor Sr. of the Cleveland Browns, and he's been the only bright spot of Cleveland this entire year. He literally had a breakout game against Miami in Week 3. He finished that game with 144 yards receiving. I remember he had 21 yards rushing. He did have a touchdown rushing in that game. And I think there was a game somewhere when he had a passing touchdown or he threw a pass or whatever. But, yeah, he's been one of those players he's been one of those gadget players where you can put him in any spots anywhere. But I'm really glad that Terrell Pryor finally made a transition to receiver because I thought he was too talented to not be in the NFL. If only Tim Tebow can do that, maybe he can do the same thing.
Right.
But Terrell Pryor, I think he's definitely more athletic than Tim Tebow is.
Oh, God, yeah.
He's definitely more athletic. So I do think it was such an easier transition for Terrell Pryor. Don't forget, Terrell Pryor, he's pretty big body as well. He is 6'4", 223, so he's a big red zone target. So he's been the only good player for the Browns. I don't think he's going to be there next year. I think he's going to get a contract somewhere else.
Right.
Someone that really needs a lot of help. Maybe L.A., maybe San Francisco. I don't know.
Right.
But he's definitely going to get a really solid contract somewhere. And I think he can be a really good number 2 receiver.
Yeah.
I don't think he's a really good true number 1 receiver. But that's my breakout player. I didn't think he was going to. I didn't expect a whole lot out of him. I forgot he was even on the team.
Right.
But, yeah, that's my breakout player of the year.
So going into this, we'll do like our MVP of the season, right? And so for me, like I know you have yours and you talked about it a little bit earlier on. For me, I'm going to go with somebody with Ezekiel Elliott because he's been somebody who came in with a lot of pressure, being a top 5 pick in the draft, someone who, you're replacing somebody, maybe not after this year, but you're replacing somebody, DeMarco Murray, who has been a kind of one of the better running backs the Cowboys have ever had. That's actually saying something with the Cowboys' history.
He's definitely been one of the top.
And
I wouldn't say he's the best they ever had.
No. But he's like, you have other people, obviously, Dorsett, Smith, stuff like that. But, you get Ezekiel Elliott who came in, and he's somebody who, from basically the jump, he's got a little bit better every single week. Starts off with 51 yards, then 83, then 140. And, even the yards, the average yards go from 2.6 to 4 to 4.7 to 6 to 8.9. He kept getting a little bit better and better and better every year. And then ever since then, he's always been right around 100 yards, 157, 96, 92, 114, 97, 97, 86, 107, 159, and 80. Outside of last week, which basically just kind of rested him at a certain point because it was just okay, cool. Tyron Smith got it. He looked like he got hurt. He's fine, but he looked like he got hurt. Dak Prescott got knocked around for a second. It's okay, cool. Zeke, go to the bench. Go now. He only had 12 rushes, so he could have had another 100 yards there. He's been the best running back in the game this year, as far as running goes.
Could be the MVP.
He very well could be the MVP, and you get that in your rookie season. That's pretty impressive. So for you, who is your MVP?
Well, I talked about it on the show earlier this week, but it was between Le'Veon Bell, Ezekiel Elliott, and David Johnson. I chose David Johnson because no matter what, he always finds ways to get 100 yards every game.
Yeah, he's been
So you can always count on him to give you at least 10 points.
Right.
And that's it. To me, that says a lot. No matter how you get 100 yards, it's 100 yards. That's 10 points. I think every standard league has that. So for that, the fact that he was pretty much the only elite, offensive player in the Arizona Cardinals. I know they have Larry Fitzgerald and Michael Floyd. He had a down year and he's no longer there. And Carson Palmer has been really disappointing. David Johnson literally put that team on his back, and for that, what he has done this year, getting at least 100 yards in every game for 15 straight games, which is the first time someone has done that since 97, which was done by Barry Sanders. So if he does it one more time against the LA Rams, which I think he's probably going to do, he'll be the first player to do it in 16 games in the season. So, that's my MVP.
I can't argue with that because if you look at him, he has more receptions, like 77 receptions. He has more than Julio Jones, Pierre Garçon, like Brandon Cooks, Jordan Matthews, Kyle Rudolph, DeAndre Hopkins. He's got more than a lot of legitimate wide receivers in the NFL. Him and Le'Veon Bell, Le'Veon's got 75 catches as well. They've been just one of the most reliable people because they have to rely on him because, Le'Veon Bell has been kind of the bailout guy for Ben Roethlisberger if stuff breaks down. And for David Johnson, like you said, Fitzgerald, but he's basically been the one guy that's been the constant being able to be relied on because that whole team has kind of been, not anywhere close to what you'd expect.
They've been really inconsistent this year. And, with the thing with David Johnson, he has over 800 yards receiving. I think he's 150 yards away from 1,000. And if that
841, so he's 159,
I think if the Cardinals were good this year, I think he would be in the MVP this
100%, yeah.
by far, if they were a playoff contention. Yeah, it's been a really great 2016, and that's all I can say. It's been a really great 2016 here at the network, even though in real life it's been kind of so-so, no matter what you think. But, I had a really great year doing these shows with you, Anthony, and I hope to, do it again in 2017.
Should be fun.
Yeah, it should be fun. But, we'd like to thank you guys for tuning in to the Golden State Media Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast. You can catch the show on a variety of platforms. Those are iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and YouTube. And, of course, as always, the GSMCpodcast.com website. And you can also follow the show on a variety of social media platforms on Twitter and Instagram. They have the same handle, that is at GSMC_football. And you can also like the show on Facebook at the Golden State Media Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast. And as always, I'm Jeremiah.
And I'm Anthony.
And see you guys next time in 2017.